I'd like to welcome you here today. It is the first of our seminars for 2020, and I was astounded to realise, the beginning of 16 years of partnership between Griffith Asia Institute and the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. And we're so pleased to continue to work with our colleagues here at the gallery who do amazing work and to bring some different perspectives to audiences on the culture, the politics, the security of the region that we're living in. So we've got a great program lined up for 2020, the Year of the Rat, and we'll be starting, of course, this evening with Professor T.V. Paul, our special guest, and James McGill, Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. Before I get to TV and what he'll be speaking about this evening, can I just ask you all to make a quick note in your diary for the 30th of April. That will be our next Perspectives Asia. And we're looking forward actually to bringing a number of Pacific youth leaders to centre stage to talk about some of the developments in the Pacific and how young people are thinking about and engaging with the shifting dynamics of the Pacific right now. And of course that fits in line with what these seminars are intended to do. We really see this as an opportunity for us, working again with the Australian Centre for Asia Pacific Art here at the Gallery of Modern Art, to explore issues of contemporary culture, politics and society in our region, while also fostering discussion with you and really understanding how Australia can relate and interpret what's happening in our world. We've been really privileged to co-host this series with our colleagues here at the gallery and are looking forward to a year of quite diverse speakers on a whole range of topics. I'd also like to make special mention of our sponsors, Yering Station, who have provided the wine, and I hope you enjoyed a glass before you came in. Yay for Yering. Look, one of the things that I really love about my work is that I get to work with people who are of incredible intellect and who spend an enormous time thinking about the world that we live in. And one of my colleagues who's here tonight, Professor Kai He, sitting in the front row, does quite a bit of thinking about the region and really trying to understand what's happening in terms of shifting dynamics, shifting power dynamics, and how Australia might relate to that. And not just Australia, but the rest of the world. As part of Kai's work, he's been able to invite Professor T.V. Paul out to Brisbane, who's spending a week with us. And T.V., you've really earned this week in Brisbane. He's spent a great deal of time speaking. We've had a fabulous range of workshops and seminars, and I'm really grateful to the time that you've spent talking and being with both scholars and students at Griffith University. So thank you, and thank you for tonight as well. Professor T.V. Paul brings a great deal of expertise. He is internationally regarded as a leading professor of international relations, and he does a great deal of thinking about what we call soft balancing. And I'm not going to give away the punchline at all. I'll leave that to you, T.V. But essentially tonight, I think T.V. Paul will be discussing how the balance of politics, balance of power is evolving, and what the implications of soft balancing are as we watch the rise of new great powers and the changes in the international order taking place not just over history but of course today as well. I mentioned that T.V. Paul comes from McGill University in Montreal. He's also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He was President of the International Studies Association, the ISA, which is about to host a conference in Hawaii, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's a tough gig being an academic, but actually I suspect it's a very tough gig being the president of that society, which really leads the way in terms of international relations thought. More importantly, I think he's the founding director of the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change, and I think he's spending a great deal of time thinking about how the transitions that we're seeing in the world today might not just occur, but might actually occur peacefully. And I understand TV is going to be devoting the rest of his life to this work. So we look forward to being a part of that research. We're really grateful to be on your radar and a part of the discussions that you and Professor Herr are having as well. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, and let me remind you, the book is available for sale in the corridor after the lecture as well. Let me please introduce Professor T.V. Paul.
Wow, this is an honor to be back in Brisbane after 34 years. I was a graduate student at the University of Queensland, 85, 86, my first year, and my wife sitting there. This was our first year of marriage, and the memories of this place are just still lingering. And we just went to the street in Toowong we lived, and it was fabulous. University of Queensland in particular, and now Griffith. My affiliations have been growing with the scholars in this part of the world. As Caitlin said, this is a... So let me thank Natasha, Kai-Hei, and Caitlin, and a series of others, and the staff here to look after us, for looking after us so nicely. And I must say, you live in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, because I'm saying this not just to please you. Every time I walk on the south shore of the thing, I sense that if only other cities did the same thing for people to walk, to play, to enjoy the urban landscape, especially the country where I come from, that's India. They don't pay attention to urban living, and which is something that I always think, only if cities imitate or do things the way, I mean, of course, every city has their problems. I'm sure you have yours too, but the point is, there are a lot of things to emulate and to respect this beautiful country as well as this city. So let me go to my topic. This is a book that I published last year, and this is a continuation of a research that received a lot of attention just before the starting of the or after the second Gulf War. And a lot of American scholars started looking at why the United States was not getting the kind of balancing that previous great powers did receive. And I started thinking about it a lot more than I did a piece in international security. There was a big debate. But then when you go back to history, it seems like this technique of self-balancing, using international institutions to restrain, constrain powerful actors, that has been going on, especially since the concert of Europe 1815. So as this picture shows, 20th century's biggest killer, after, of course, natural causes, had been wars. And I don't need to tell Australians, for a small country of population size, your participation in all the major wars have been immense, and the kind of sacrifices this country paid for freedom in particular must be recognized. And so what you notice is that some 109 million people perished in 2 world wars, and some 40 million Cold War, and many millions still going on. What we see in the Middle East, for instance, have a lot to do with the kind of misplaced politics, sometimes not so, people not thinking through what they're doing. And what we are seeing is also that the great powers, the big players, are sometimes engaging in conflict directly and indirectly. And I think we need to pay more attention to their behavior. When do they get into conflict? When do they engage in peace? And that's important because their allies, including countries like Australia, Canada, where I live, are often asked to participate in conflicts. And we cannot just leave this to destiny, this idea of great power conflict. That seems to recur in human history, at least past 300, 400 years. Now we are at a very difficult phase in our cycle of international conflict and cooperation. That is the rise of China, the resurgence in Russia to some extent, and many of the theories that we deal with in international politics expect war as a system-changing mechanism. And I think that's a mistake, but yet these are the books that sell. The most recent one, Harvard professor Graham Allison's book on Thucydides' trap, or that the rising Athens forcing the Spartans to start a war, just like that a rising China today may encourage the United States to challenge China at some point. But this is probably an exaggerated view, given that the world has changed a lot, and I will talk a little bit about the kind of changes that have taken place. But one has to be cautious. You cannot leave these sort of themes to chance, or things can change very rapidly. And we need to think about war prevention strategies more than we sort of leave that to great powers or a few diplomats, but that's not enough. That's what I'm trying to argue here. So one of the most traditional approaches to international security, and those who know international relations theory, it's sort of the realist tradition that is balance of power. Balance of power is the idea that the international system is conflictual, anarchic. That means the powerful state will attempt to dominate if it is not restrained, if it is not constrained through countervailing power. And if that countervailing power takes place, there is an equilibrium, and the equilibrium will generate kind of peace or security in the world. And this comes out of a long tradition of European international relations. European theorists talked about it from the Enlightenment period onwards, as if it was a very natural phenomenon. It happens automatically. But actually, it doesn't often happen automatically. Countries have to form two mechanisms. One is building up their military strength. The other one is alignment among like-minded states. And the puzzle is, since the end of the Cold War, you don't find intense hard balancing. Now it's slowly picking up some military buildup, but not many alignments as was during the Cold War or before that. So there are multiple reasons people talk about. Perhaps the world has changed, and that you have presence of economic globalization, territory is no longer needed for becoming wealthy, and there are multiple institutions in the international arena that constrain states or try to help solve problems. You have nationalism, you have territorial integrity norm. That means conquest and occupation of a territory and gaining international recognition is difficult. The military technology favors defense and deterrence, for instance, nuclear weapons over offense. Remember, it was the tank and the aircraft that allowed the Germans to think about blitzkrieg as a strategy or doctrine. And the threat environment remains somewhat mellowed. So we are talking about balancing against threats. No longer it's that power that challenges states to engage in this sort of behavior. So I kind of categorize, using the literature, three types of balancing that have taken place in historical terms. One is hard balancing, that is where you have the military alignment as well as the military buildup. The other one is soft balancing, and then limited hard balancing, which may include some elements of both. And so what is soft balancing? It's the restraining of the power of a state through international institutions, concerted diplomacy via limited informal ententes and economic sanctions in order to make its aggressive actions less legitimate in the eyes of the world and hence its goals more difficult to obtain. Now, the picture you're seeing is the Concert of Europe, a Congress of Vienna, 1815, where the five great powers, including the defeated French statesmen sitting there, and determining the fate of the world. And this was the first, according to historians, first meeting of the great powers to solve the problems of the day, but they had an ulterior motive, which is to maintain the status quo in Europe. But they brought in France, defeated France into this meeting. which is very different from defeated Germany in 1919. And there's some people argue that if only the winners of World War I brought in Germany as they did France here, maybe we wouldn't have had World War II. Of course, wishful thinking probably, but still, this is a big problem. The great powers are big egomaniacs. Now, it may sound familiar. They need recognition, they need respect. And unfortunately, the German representative was brought into the Treaty of Versailles, brought him like a criminal and asked to sign dotted lines. This is where actually a lot of guilt goes to France and some to Britain for that particular moment in history. Now, what is the source of soft balancing? And I think it is international institutions. This is a big contested topic in our discipline. I won't go into the details. But one thing is very important to realize, the increasing number of institutions, this is not just the United Nations, that's the General Assembly, but you have a series of other institutions, including regional ones, that have proliferated since the end of the Cold War. And do they serve any purpose? Some people say no, but I would say that they do have a purpose, and should include the delegitimation of great power behavior in particular. So the book details some case studies, the Congress of Vienna, which I think was perhaps history's first important soft balancing effort. I mean, Congress of Vienna had a lot of other goals, but this was very important. And it had a reasonable success for 2 decades, or 3 decades, some people say, until the Crimean War. So the great powers restrained themselves. The Russians had a desire to conquer the parts of Ottoman Empire, but quite a few wars were stopped as a result of this self-binding mechanism. But that didn't last, and that's the problem with international politics. The material conditions change, the political climate changes, and with that changes, you notice that the desire to conquer, so you need balance of power, some form or other. We are in that one of those transition phases right now. This is where we will conclude with the discussion. So you have the League of Nations, which tried to restrain an aggressive Japan, especially in China and Manchuria, and Italy that had conquered Abyssinia. And both were failures because both these were expansionist powers. They wanted to conquer whatever they could. And there were attempts to restrain Germany as well, Hitler's Germany. And so then I come to the Cold War, which was a quintessential case study of hard balancing. The 2 power blocks, we saw some pictures before, engage in intense arms race, arms buildup. And then, but during the Cold War, you had a set of countries, emerging countries, and you see their pictures there, led by Nehru, Kwame Nkrumah, Sukarno, Tito, then Nasser. They formed what you call the non-aligned movement. Before that, of course, the Bantung spirit in 1955. And their efforts are not considered as great in terms of success, but I show that, at least in the chapter, there was a normative change they created, especially for decolonization, which is the new countries that emerged, and also challenging the nuclear world order. Quite a few things they did through United Nations General Assembly. But it wasn't a fully successful enterprise because some of them were not aligned, to be very frank, at the end. And now you have Cold War ended peacefully somewhat, and you have the US-led war on Yugoslavia and Kosovo, Iraq. In both times, the other great powers, China, Russia in the first case, and Russia, China, and some allies of the United States, including Germany and France, tried to restrain the US, tried to stop it from going into war in Iraq. This is 2003. They used the UN General Assembly mechanism by denying approval, by vetoing, and the US tried its best to get a resolution approved. So what was the effort there? The effort was to delegitimize this invasion, ill-conceived invasion in many ways. There was no nuclear weapons in Iraq. It was very much a fabricated war. And today you find ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, using soft balancing as part of their hedging strategy. Essentially, it's an insurance policy to prevent great power contest, especially involving China and the United States. And they are trying to create a set of norms, somewhat successful in some level, but at the same time not that successful. And so what is the purpose of all these institutional mechanisms? And the purpose is to use institutions to legitimate one's power and delegitimize opponents' behavior. So great powers use them as institutions. They go to these meetings. What is interesting is even Trump sent some representative. I believe he's meeting the ASEAN states in Las Vegas or someplace, I don't know where, but clearly, if there is no purpose in meeting them, why are they being called for a meeting? It's not total waste, there's something behind these meetings. And I think we have to look at great power behavior from the point of view of what you call legitimation. Great powers need a lot of legitimacy. Without legitimacy and recognition, they cannot sustain durable power. And that's why they are very sensitive. China today is very sensitive to criticisms because they want to be loved and accepted, whatever they're doing, although they're doing a lot of things here and there. And this is a challenge for international relations. So the post-Cold War era, the first 2 decades, we witnessed a relative peaceful period in human history. It's amazing that it was reasonably peaceful. And of course, today, the rise of China, and of course, Russia's efforts creating certain amount of response. And the rise of China has not generated the kind of intense hard balancing that in other periods in human history. This remains a puzzle. Why is China not receiving what you call an intense balance of power coalition or intense military buildup? There is military buildup. And so I recently published a couple of articles and 2 arguments. One is China's grand strategy. It's this peaceful rise strategy, although has a lot of problems in South China Sea, has given a certain amount of assurance to others that it is not going to engage in war as the previous rising powers did. And secondly, China is the #1 trading partner of almost every state in Asia Pacific in particular. So China has become economically interdependent, and so China is engaging other states, but China is also expanding, which is through this so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Some critics would say this is another way of, like East India companies, spread their wings around the whole region. Others say that it has its positive things because many of these small states don't have investment, infrastructure in particular, that they need something from a country like China. But is it the purpose is to have dominance, hegemony as we call it, or is it more a benign approach, kind of a tributary model of yesteryears? But clearly it is not a very innocent program. It is something there that needs to be understood. And is this BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, will it prevent a great power war? And that is a big question. And my argument, at least in the recent piece I said, is as long as China doesn't militarize this thing, BRI, China doesn't add a navy to it. See, this is the difference with East India Company models. The East India companies had navies with them. They came to Australia too, by the way. So that model, if China somehow manages, it will definitely make a lot of headway in the 21st century. Now, by the way, when I say all this headway means I didn't expect the coronavirus to become such a big issue. I didn't expect trade could stop if all the transportation links stop for sustained period of time, and that can be something that we don't plug in these variables in our models when we talk about these things, because it's very hard to predict what the next disease would be or what the next challenge would be. So countries have formed a kind of strategic options to China, and I'm sure Australia is also, reading your newspaper, there is always this anxiety where what should we do? Clearly, the so-called pivot strategy that the Obama administration, somewhat of a failure, one must say, but if China was such a threat, why did it go for such a minimal amount of balancing? So it was a limited hard balancing, including sending some troops to Australia. And Japan's attitude is also very much a mixture of strategies. India, for instance, talk about very limited military buildup. There's a lot of talk about coalitions with Japan, United States. Mr. Trump was in India recently. And Quad, the quadrilateral, we hear about it. So countries are playing different strategies in the face of China's rise. They're not forming the old historical patterns of hard balancing, as I discussed before. And that is a puzzle. Why is it so happening? And whether it is sustainable or not. And so this is sustainable up to a point. It doesn't probably even prevent certain aggressive behavior. That picture shows you, or the cartoon shows you, Mr. Putin is thinking that he is listening, but he's probably not. So you have these challenges, and some argue that this kind of efforts don't really stop aggressive great power behavior, that we need certain conditions to support institutional balancing or sub-balancing, as we know. And here I list the ideal conditions. They include the threat environment has to remain low, economic cost has to be high for aggressive power, to start a war. Great powers believe in legitimate power, and no thoroughly disenchanted revisionist state. This is very important to think about. Both rising China and not so rising, but somewhat rising India are big beneficiaries of economic globalization. This is very rare in human history. Look what Japan and Germany were complaining in the 1930s. We are not beneficiaries of the economic order. And they say today the biggest supporters of globalization are these two countries. And that is why we have to look at it as a very different model at this point. And the nationalism that you see is also not that intense, although it is changing. And technology is not facilitating quick conquest. Now, as you can see, when I wrote this book 3 years, or finished the manuscript 3 years ago, things were slowly changing. And all these elements are slowly changing. The last one in particular, we don't know what AI or artificial intelligence will do to the ability of states to fight. We are seeing increased nationalism in China, India, United States, many Western countries too. Revisionist state, whether the United States is a revisionist state is a question mark, or is it going to be maintaining international order under the so-called populist leaders? So I won't go into that. This kind of soft approaches are a big part of international relations. In international law, you have something called soft law, soft power, not so precise, but I think we need to think about soft balancing as adding richness, broadening the concept. And it's also a tool for state leaders to adapt from doing nothing to doing something. If you don't do anything, show your displeasure. And if you show your displeasure through building armies as well as huge military force or going into an open rivalry, you lose the trade advantage you have. So that's the problem with China. You can only go up to a point if China still remains your number one trading partner, investment source. So this international order that is emerging is, as I said, we are in a very interesting phase in that evolution. Because of material advances, material changes, countries' fortunes change. And when their fortunes change, we don't know how they respond to the changing conditions. And in order to restrain them, especially the big powers, we need good institutions, good ideas, good norms. And the system becomes more complex. We need to think about flexible strategies rather than this very black and white strategies of yesteryears. And that's why I think soft balancing is an important component. But I wouldn't put this as a panacea for all our ills. We have these processes happening, populism, nativism, and the picture clearly tells you this interaction, very difficult times. This is the G7 meeting in Canada. And look at the facial expressions. So these are Western allies, by the way. The dangers of deglobalization are all over the place because people expect certain things to happen certain ways, but globalization can produce a lot of winners and losers. And some can think of themselves as losers even when they are winners. And there are people who say the United States is also a beneficiary of globalization. Otherwise, it would have abandoned it by now. But of course, many Americans did not, because if you don't have the right tools, assets, education and all that, it's hard to make a big benefit out of globalization. So that's generating these sort of cycles of unhappy domestic situations. And that you have now the technological buildup for arms buildup. You have a problem with proper leadership. That's another problem, because you don't have very good leaders who are committed to institutions, UN in particular. So the book is an effort to give some warning also towards the end that it is not automatic that the maintenance of peace and order institutions will continue. We need creative leaders. We don't need reckless leaders. We need also people committed to creating world order, international order. See, every order that was created had somebody working for it. Post-war order, 1945, 47 period, 49 period. A lot of people worked for that order that was created. That order is now under challenge. And we need more leadership, better leadership to understand how we can maintain international peace and order, and should not leave this to destiny or some kind of inanimate forces will solve the problem, because it requires human agency. So I will stop there, and I'm sure you have some questions. We can take a few questions, I guess, Caitlin? Yes. Yes. Oops. You want me to move?
Thank you. No, you stay there. Thank you so much, TV Paul. We do have a little bit of time for questions. And thank you for taking some questions this evening. So we might just go, we've got a roving microphone, so if you can just let us have 1 second to get to. I think we've got one in the front here to begin with.
Thank you. Hello.
Please introduce yourself if you
Is
can.
it on? Hello. Hi, my name is Ashutosh Mishra, and I'm the CEO of Institute for Australia-India Engagement. TV, like always, is blooming, wonderful reading your articles and listening to you. And that was the case again today. Two quick ones. You talked about soft power balancing through institutions. My first question is the very presence of big powers in the institutions. It in a way neutralizes the kind of effect that we want soft power, so balancing to take place through institutions. And second one is, the last photograph was very interesting, and what I found very interesting was that there were only two leaders with their hands folded, and that were Donald Trump and the Chinese president. And which in a way was indicating that both these countries didn't want to reveal much and they didn't want to budge much. So is that a way of their own looking at the world system, that we don't want to budge on any issue at the moment and we'll bide our time while you are thinking you are doing soft balancing, and we'll break past when we think it is the right time for us to do so? Thank you.
You want to take more, or I should respond? Yeah. Okay, I think, yeah, that is a big debate in our field also, that whether these big powers are there just to pursue their interests. Are they using the institutions? But they are needed to create the institutions. And the big point is whether, even if they are not fully following institutional efforts by others, the fact that they go to these institutions. Imagine a world without institutions. Where will they be talking? They will be talking among themselves, like the concert kind of world. So institutions offer the second-ranking states a certain venue to engage and sometimes restrain, not all the time, but clearly, if the effort is to stop them from going from war, the effort to stop George Bush did not succeed. But I have some discussion about that impact that had on American domestic politics. It's fascinating that Obama picked up that topic when he was contesting, he said, we need to get out of Iraq because our legitimacy as this great power, superpower, is affected by this, this intervention. And the American public bought that to some extent. So one of his biggest arguments was that we lost our good name, we need to get out of this place. So sometimes these things take a long time to materialize, and it has to affect through domestic politics. So right now we are at a phase where Americans are very divided. You see the divisions they have, the whole debate, you watch the Democratic Party. And so the American politics is going into these pendulums. And it's very interesting to see whether some of them, the Democratic candidates in particular, are big fans of the institutions. And if they come to power, which is questionable at this point, the point is that they will not abandon institutions. They are liberals. They're liberal institutions, they're called. So I don't want to completely abandon institutions. And even China, it's fascinating how active China is in institutions. It comes to ASEAN meetings, sometimes try to create a wedge, but to have legitimacy for its policies, it needs these institutions. And China is a big supporter of the UN, by the way. If UN peacekeeping, I'm not talking about only the UN General Security Council, but the UN affiliated, associated agencies. China has been playing a lot of role. WTO, I mean, we may say that WTO is going to fail or whatever, but the point that people don't realize how many cases WTO has adjudicated against the great powers, United States, China, India, and they often go by WTO because it gives them cover. If it is not that institutional source, they would find it difficult to accept. So often we don't hear about it because it's conducted in a trade and all these issue areas. So I'm not saying that institutions are always followed by the big powers, but we need the big powers too to support institutions, peacekeeping, for instance, or peace enforcement. The leaders don't budge. They have to give this image of macho men, obviously. We know what I'm talking about. But do they always win the case? They don't necessarily. They don't necessarily, the outcomes that we see in international politics. So even if they don't budge, they don't give like they are budging, and it is a function of their domestic politics, what they are trying to do. You notice that there are areas where they may be susceptible, and sometimes others will ignore them. Okay, the TTP. Now, there is another agreement here. Americans are not in it, but doesn't mean that it is completely gone. RCEP, another one that may happen in the region too. So Australia took initiative in Asia Pacific, many of these institutions created by smaller states. ASEAN was not created by great powers, okay? It was to stop the great powers from engaging in conflict. The SAARC, the South Asian Association, was the proposal by Bangladesh. So there are a lot of these small states sometimes work for creating institutions, and these institutions can sustain. I'm not a complete fan of institutions. There's a lot of politics within institutions. There's power politics, but they are important mechanisms in international politics, and we cannot just say that they don't matter at all. If they don't matter, we shouldn't see these many meetings happening. And think about India, your case. Modi goes to almost every meetings. I mean, we know what Modi's political philosophy is, but clearly he finds something there attractive, and there is also bilateral meetings. He engages with the Chinese all the time. There's something that not just showing alone, it gives certain confidence building for a rising power in that context. So,
I'm Australian now.
well, but you are defending India.
It's a lovely city, that's why I live here.
Thank you.
Is there another part to your question, sorry?
No.
I think we have one up the back and then one on the side. You got the back.
Hi, my name is Alica Kizekova, and my main affiliation is in Institute of International Relations Prague, but I'm at Bonn University also. I always appreciate your talks, T.V. Paul. As you know, I I'm your fan club. I heard you in Prague at Charles University. I'm here again. And I study soft balancing, and I always feel like we are reducing the discussion to what the US is doing and what Trump is doing. And I think if we study the theory and as a state strategy, I think we can forget about Trump, because I feel like we're stuck with Trump for a long time, and he doesn't support the institutions. But there is another player in game, and I think we don't talk enough about the European Union. And I recently went to a Raisina dialogue in India, and we talk about India's and EU's interactions and saving pretty much a rules-based system and how they can maintain the institutions, because part of them, it is to be sort of policemen, I would say, and support the norms that we want to maintain in the global system. So what is your take on the EU's role in terms of soft balancing, because it is the one that is maintaining the multilateralism and diplomatic dialogue in cases such as Iran, that many don't want to talk to Iran, but EU has tried to maintain the dialogue with Iran because it was part of the negotiation to have the treaty. And also India, we brushed on India, but India has become a vocal critic of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, even in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That was a mechanism for soft balancing the United States for a long time. So that is weakening the SCO's ability, I think, to act as an actor towards the US in the future. So how India can soft balance more specifically in the future, I'm talking like 10 to 15 years from now, because it is quite active. So EU's and India's roles.
Yeah, good questions. I think the book has some discussion of the European Union, but not as much. For this audience in particular, my effort is to look at the Indo-Pacific, where China and the United States are the key players. So it's not any preference. European Union, as you know, has multiple institutional other purposes. It is the biggest, what you call, pluralistic security community, and going through, of course, some challenges now. Iran is an interesting case you mentioned. But you notice that it's not so easy for the European Union to maintain a common position against the United States. And the United States, unfortunately, is still the hegemonic power. We just had a colleague from Copenhagen who did a study on, for the Danish government, its role during the Gulf War. And he went through a lot of documents what the Danish government was considering. And the number one question is, what will the United States think? What will we do? How will we respond to the United States? I'm sure in Australia you have the same problem sometimes. This is fortunately, the American power that is still going on. And India just had a meeting with Mr. Trump. I mean, unbelievable, the level of, somebody this morning asked me this question, why Indians are so fascinated by America? I mean, because there was a response, this question was asked to a former foreign secretary in India, and he said, during the last 100 years, no country has become an economic success without being affiliated to the United States in some fashion. There may be some truth in that, although some countries have destroyed themselves by playing the United States game. That's another issue. So we can't just wish away the United States. The United States is still a very powerful state. And the Trump phenomenon is an aberration? Obviously, it's a very unique phenomenon. But you find a kind of populism in different countries, including India. I can't say Mr. Modi is not a populist. I mean, the kind of things he's doing, especially in the domestic sphere, you find that there's a lot of misreading about countries, what they can achieve, what kind of status they will achieve by pursuing different kinds of strategies. And it is very unsure whether these strategies will produce the outcome they're looking for. And so you mentioned 10, 15 years from now, I am still betting that there will be some institutional balancing in international politics. But we are going through a very complex process right now, given the domestic politics of some of these countries. This is something that no one can get a full handle. I have no way to say where India will be, the way it is going. With the violence that we've just witnessed after several decades of relative peace, I'm afraid it's going to hurt India if it's not going to put a control over this tendency to use communal forces against each other, whoever is instigating it. So in domestic politics in the United States, there's such divisions. I have been in North America for almost 3 decades or more than 3 decades, and what is noticing is the consensus is lost. There's extreme left, extreme right. You know, it's unfortunate, but the Americans have a capacity for pragmatism. They can come together on various issues. And let's hope that will happen. And the point here is that it is not just these big powers, but small states also have to have some instruments. And the European Union is a composition of different small states, and so Iran is a good case. Whether they succeed completely, but the point is that they may be preventing a war. Okay, this is something we have to think about. The European Union is not there. This could escalate a lot faster than with Iran. So there's a cushioning force, and I think I acknowledge that. But the book is dealing with these big powers and their problems. The European Union is not a unified actor in that process, but a lot more room for this sort of analysis, and the European Union definitely should be part of that.
Just behind you, I think, gentleman.
Thanks very much. It's a very interesting talk. Sorry, just 2 quick questions if I can beg your time. First of all, the elephant in the room, coronavirus. How does coronavirus affect China's standing, status, global influence, presence?
Which one?
Coronavirus.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah, coronavirus. And the second one is about Australia. If I can ask you, how do you see Australia in terms of balancing those 2 big powers of China, US, China being our biggest economic trade partner and US being our security partner? Thanks.
Yeah, actually, Australia is playing soft balancing quite a bit with the idea of creating a relationship with India, with the ASEAN countries, the Quad they talk about, and reasonable limited balancing through arms acquisition and building your naval forces, etc. So it's doing all sorts of mechanisms. Whether Australia will be completely secure in that process, I have no way to know. But one thing, though, Australia cannot... see, unlike Canada, I mean, because Canada is a little bit more protected by the American natural walls there, Australia obviously has its limitations. It's in a region which has potential for major conflict. So I noticed the big difference in your media coverage on security issues. Last few days, you know, there's a lot more issue of security here than in Canada, for instance, which is quite amazing. Canadians don't talk about these Chinese rise. I mean, there's irritation with China over trade issues or whatever. And so Australia has a unique challenge, but Australia has to use institutions. There is no other mechanism. You cannot just rely on pure American alliance or hard balancing alone. Australia is a good candidate for using different mechanisms, techniques, and engaging these powers, including China, to prolong the so-called stability you have. I don't know how to say about coronavirus. It's a non-traditional security threat, and the world is not geared for it. We have been talking about these sort of pandemics, but this is a very sudden arrival, and we don't know where it will end, especially in places where there are no proper healthcare system. And the kind of psychosis, it's sort of creating this panic and fear that very rarely you hear, except for maybe when wars start or, the Europeans in certain period. So just like you, I'm also very uncertain, and we are going to many conferences and trips, and some of them may have to be canceled very soon. So we don't know where it will end, or this is some kind of a nature's act to stop humans to do certain things properly. I don't know. I don't have a proper answer. It's a very uncertain thing. But it is a big challenge to nation states because their idea of borders are challenged so dramatically. It's not easy to talk about borders anymore.
We might try and just fit those two questions in, the lady and the gentleman.
You partially answered one of my questions, but just looking at the definition of what a great power is these days, and then secondly, who represents the great powers, is in the representation of the great powers, representation of the country, and how that's changing given the popularism and equal unpopularity of some of the people who represent those great powers on the world stage.
Yeah, that is actually very interesting whether these powerful states have the legitimacy of what they claim. But I was talking this morning, this is something that happened in 1945 after World War II. The San Francisco settlement, the agreement that the winners of World War II created a great power system with the P5. But the notion of great power is also a very European idea, by the way, coming out of the European imperial orders. They are now under challenge. I mean, why should we consider France or Britain as a great power? Of course, for other reasons. But they stay on in the Security Council. They like to keep that position because of the position they have. So the idea of great power, the greatness is questionable, some, as you rightly pointed out. How great are they? It's just... Actually, there are a lot of emperors with the name attached, great. They are biggest Frederick the Great, big conquerors, Because if Napoleon had won, he would be Napoleon the Great, but he didn't win. I mean, so I hope Hitler wouldn't have been given that title either. He had won. It's unfortunate that winning wars were considered as the way to become great. Catherine the Great, it's amazing. But the point is, this is a contested term. But there is something there, the major power, that with the highest amount of material as well as soft power or whatever, ought to have a hierarchical role, which is you cannot wish away their position. They can change the course of history, as we all know. And their contests matter. So China, US, obviously their relationship matters to Australia, So smaller states, however important they are affected by these interactions. And so the term great is bad, but major power or something has to be recognized for the countries with the largest material and other power resources that can affect the destinies of other states or the futures of other states. But then great power is a term institutionalized through giving them a role in international institutions like the UN, League of Nations, before the Concert of Europe. So from a normative point of view, they need not be the nicest states in the world. I mean, there's no way we can say. Or the actions they do to themselves. I mean, this populism business, many of you probably visit America. United States, the priorities of the United States. You have so many homeless people, so many people suffering without medical care. Yet it spends so much money on this great power status to maintain on arms, on other things. So there is that problem, and it gets worsened when you have populists in power because their priorities are showing off rather than solving domestic problems. So I agree, great power is a misnomer, a term that needs to be changed, but I also acknowledge, one should also acknowledge that power differentials exist and some are powerful, and some seek power, domination, so they need to be restrained. That's all I would say.
I might just try and sneak in the very last question with the gentleman at the back. Sorry, we're just running out of time.
Thank you very much. I'm a PhD student, Yuan Jiang. I'm doing a project about the Belt and Road Initiative in Russia and Australia.
I don't get it.
Sorry, I'm a PhD student. I'm doing a project about Belt and Road Initiative in Russia and Australia. Yeah, I'm a Russian speaker as well. So my question is, since you mentioned about the great powers, how Russia restrain the great power of China in Central Asia. I mean, the point is there's the EU, Economic Erasure Union, and the BRI, the combination of two projects. But I see nominally, the Chinese and Russian talk to each other, we cooperate each other very well, something kind of this kind of narrative. But essentially, in practice, I don't think so. How do you think, in future, Russia can balance China's power in Central Asia? I see right now, Russia tried to invite India to join the EU as a kind of strategy to balance China, secretly, not publicly. Yeah, that's my
news
question.
to me. Actually, Russia-China relationship is not a military alliance yet, which is amazing, isn't it? And that shows that they are also reluctant to form a hard-balancing military coalition. They have increased cooperation, but the readings I have, Russia is uncomfortable with China's rise. Russia thinks itself as a great power, a superpower. They haven't given up their desire to be a dominant second player in the world. They don't think they lost the Cold War, and Putin's problem is that. Putin has never found this idea of bipolar between China and the United States. Russia cannot accept that. And so I would be, if you are Russian, the status matters to them. They are very... No, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about anyone who is, I'm assuming that somebody is from a Russian background. Because the West in particular, the United States, thinks that Russia lost the Cold War. Russians would say that we have given concessions to you, and expecting reciprocity. And so Mikhail Gorbachev is a very unhappy man today because he was not making these concessions without expecting some reciprocity, especially the expansion of NATO. So there are a lot of things the Russians, whatever their behavior is, dissatisfaction with that order too, but at the same time, they have formed limited strategic partnership with China. My reading is that they also use institutions, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a lot of series of institutions in Central Asia, to make sure China doesn't completely dominate the region or the economics of the region. So this mechanism is used in different formats in different parts of the world. And what is interesting is that both Russia and China are also cautious how far they go in creating balance of power. But there are tensions in that relationship. That's very natural. By the way, the tensions in China is all China relationship, but which is small states in your region. I'm sure you talk to them privately, they'll say there are tensions. But China is very successful creating at least a semblance of cooperation among them. And as long as they don't become complete dependencies, there is a chance that some of them will succeed. So I think your question is important. But there are people who are working on the use of institutions in Central Asia by the Central Asian states themselves. Okay, that's an interesting, to make sure these two states don't get into intense conflict. So there's a lot of dynamics there going on, and it's not all through military or economic means, it's also through institutions. Thank you. Yes.
If you'd just like to put your hands together and thank Professor T.V. Paul. My name's Taru Nagesh. I'm one of the curators here, a curator of Asian art at the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art. And it's my pleasure to offer a vote of thanks tonight for a very engaging and insightful lecture. Firstly, an enormous thank you to Professor T.V. Paul for taking the time to speak to us here tonight out of what I hear is an intense schedule. And we greatly appreciate the time and the planning that are always such a big part of these engagements. And you've really addressed such an interesting topic in such a compelling and engaging way, I think. I was thinking about this topic today and I thought, it's such a timely and critical subject to think about One that speaks in so many interesting ways to other Perspectives Asia lectures we've had here as well. But all I couldn't get out of my head, Donald Trump speaking in India this week to over 100,000 elated Indians because he mispronounced a couple of Indian cricket players' names in Narendra Modi's home state. And this was so well documented. You almost failed to hear about the failed security and trade deals that they were supposed to sign. And meanwhile, you have these violent confrontations which came from a region which India and China used to fight over. So I want to thank you so much for giving us so much to think about tonight. I'll cut this very short because we've just run out of time, but I wanted to mention T.V. Paul's recent book, Restraining Great Powers, is still on sale, I think, on your way out if you didn't manage to get a copy on the way in. I also wanted to mention the professor has a great website which has all kinds of links and information about his other activities and writing, so do have a look if you haven't already, as well as links and interviews to the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change. Perspectives Asia is a very proud partnership between the Griffith Asia Institute and ACAPA, the Gallery's Australian Centre for Asian and Pacific Art. I'd like to sincerely thank all the staff involved, organising and running the event. And finally, thank you all for coming and supporting Perspectives Asia, many of you on a very regular basis. It's such a dedicated and engaged audience that makes it possible for us to bring speakers of such diversity and such high calibre from all over the world here. And I know it always stimulates a lot of conversation afterwards in so many different forums around Brisbane and beyond. We hope to all see you for our next Perspectives Asia, as Caitlin mentioned, on the 30th of April, which is a Pacific Youth Forum panel. And there's more details about both past and future Perspectives Asia lectures, including some videos on the Griffith University website. I'd like to very quickly present Professor T.V. Paul with a very small gift to show our appreciation. Thank you all for coming and enjoy your evening.